everyone, it's Sevi. This video is a continuation of my main Cyno guide, where I'll discuss more about Cyno synergies with specific teammates, how to best make those reactions and team templates work, and various tips in maximizing your team's DPS. Due to Cyno's long on-field time, one major consideration is how your team's cooldowns work with Cyno. There's fewer units that can last for most of Cyno's burst time, which means sometimes you'll just have to work with Cyno still doing his damage but having no more buffs. So I'll go through teams I found he works very well in, but I'll also mention some off-meta teams that can still be workable. Let's start with an Aggravate team, which is Cyno's standard team comp, and likely what his quick Electro kit was mainly created for. Of course, you need a Dendro unit first, and Dendro Traveler is just the best pick over Cole in any of Cyno's Dendro teams due to Traveler's burst lasting longer and having better range. Since Deepwood is useless here, equip either a Noblesse or Instructor set on them for better team damage. Next, we want another Electro to share Aggravates with. The top Electro recommendation is Fischl for single target scenarios and Beidou for multi-target mobs. Beidou in particular offers helpful defensive utility with her burst's increased resistance to interruption and damage reduction buffs. Lisa can also work, albeit to a lesser extent. At least her defense shredding ability can be active for Cyno's entire field time, and she can act as a pseudo healer with Prototype Amber if needed. Yay, while she can technically work, it's harder to execute due to her cooldowns not synergizing as well with a Cyno-focused team, and she'll extend rotations even more due to her field time requirement. This is a situation where a 4-piece Thunder Soother will be amazing on your second Electro DPS in case you farmed a good set. You can slot in a dedicated Electro healer, which are Cookie or Dory. The trade-off is they can heal Cyno for a good part of his on-field time at the expense of lower team damage. Finally, for the flex slot, it's a choice between an Anemo unit or Zhongli, or even another Electro unit. If you're not using an Electro healer, then slotting in a dedicated Anemo healer, Jin or Sayu, helps a lot for survivability. Kazuha, Sucrose, and Venti have their own particular kit strengths, and with their Electro infusion, they can also contribute Aggravate reactions. Just note that the VV effect only lasts for 10 seconds, and it can't be refreshed if the user is off-field. So even if your Anemo unit swirls right before switching to Cyno, and Cyno still has to do his burst animation, you'll have about 7 seconds of VV shred left for his burst uptime. If you don't have a healer at all, a shield bot build Zhongli is very recommended as he has both defensive and offensive utility thanks to his resistance shredding. And here you can equip him with an Archaic Petra or Tenacity set. While Archaic Petra is barely going to buff Cyno's field time, it can at least be snapshotted by some Electro units like Fischl or Beidou.
Their penance is due!
Pause, reveal, scatter, exterminate!
Gather!
Midnight Phantasma!
Surrender! Judgment is upon you! You stay condemned! Their penance is due!
The next team is Quickbloom, which is a combination of Quicken Aggravate and Hyperbloom. So it's basically slotting in a Hydro unit who will trigger blooms to generate cores, which Cyno will then Hyperbloom with his skill or normal attacks. The goal in a Quickbloom team is to still keep up some Aggravates while proccing Hyperbloom damage. Now, Hydro can remove a Quicken aura, so in order to maintain the Quicken and Aggravate reactions, you will have to use a slower Hydro applicator, but that restricts your options. Mona is a very bad choice due to her Hydro application being too short, which means your viable options so far are Kokomi, Barbara, or Ayato for that role, and at least 2 of them are healers, which covers your team's survival needs. Kokomi's main issue is that you'll need to position her jellyfish strategically, and if enemies exit its range then you're not getting the blooms. The jellyfish duration is also limited to 12 seconds. Barbara's Hydro application is at least mobile, and due to her passive, you can extend her skill up to 20 seconds. However, she does have a painfully long cooldown which can make for awkward waiting time between rotations. This can be alleviated by using sacrificial fragments to reset her skill cooldown. Ayato will mainly be used for his burst, though you'll have to stay within its circle. Fortunately, Ayada's burst also gives a normal attack damage buff to anyone in it, which Cyno actually can make use of. However, he will want an extremely high ER, upwards of 200%. Getting his burst up is top priority rather than his damage, since his sole purpose in this team is for hydro application. As for the last slot, you want someone that doesn't interrupt the reactions or steal Hyperblooms. A top choice is actually Beidou as another Electro unit, because Beidou's burst does not steal Hyperblooms, which reliably keeps Cyno as the trigger. More so, you'll likely use this team in a multi-target scenario, and that's where Beidou is really strong. While other units can technically work, like another Dendro, Geo, or Anemo, similar to Aggravate options mentioned before, having another Electro really capitalizes on the Aggravate reactions this team provides. If you do use other Electro units, depending on who it is, there is a chance they'll steal Hyperblooms from Cyno, but at least they'll benefit from Aggravates too.
Your sins weigh upon your soul. You stand condemned. Your penance is due.
A Hyperbloom team is basically taking the same team template but using a faster off-field hydro applicator to trigger more blooms and have lower quicken uptime. Cyno is intended to be the trigger for Hyperbloom reactions, so a full EM build on him will be the best. For Hydro teammates, since we want a fast applicator, we have Xingqiu or Yelan as the top options. The main differences are basically that Xingqiu has more defensive utility, which is sorely needed in this team, faster Hydro application, and longer Hydro uptime with C2, while Yelan has a passive that gives the active character an increasing damage bonus, which Cyno can maximize with his field time. For the fourth slot, Beidou is the only viable Electro unit, as you strictly do not want another Electro to steal Hyperblooms. But as long as you just slot in a unit that doesn't disrupt the Hyperbloom and quicken reactions, then that's also okay.
Rain outlines your fate.
Witness my great undertaking. Suta, judgment is upon you. Guilty. Your penance is due. Guilty. You stand condemned. Your penance is due.
Taser or Electrocharged teams are something we're very familiar with, and at least now we're getting a viable on-field Electro driver. First, select an off-field Hydro unit that Cyno will drive, which will either be Xingqiu or Yelan again. Then for the third unit, it will either be another Hydro or an Electro unit. There's a good selection of Electro units which can fill offensive and or survival needs, but a noteworthy synergy is pairing Xingqiu and Beidou. That's because their combined interruption resistance and damage reduction buffs are really valuable for protecting Cyno. The fourth slot is flexible enough as long as the unit doesn't interrupt with Electrocharged reactions. An Anemo unit will be a top choice, mainly for shredding Hydro and Electro resistance, or Zhongli again.
Nowhere to run. Your sins weigh upon your soul. You stand condemned. Guilty. You stand condemned. Guilty.
Let me weave you a verse. Rain outlines your fate. Huh? Eyes on me! Animal test 6308. Absorption.
Through me, justice is served.
Then we have a classic team template. We're all familiar with the national team's reputation, and they've gotten yet another unit that can fit in to create an overload vaporized team. In this team, Cyno becomes the driver of Xingqiu to trigger Electrocharged reactions, then Xiangling will be triggering Overload and Vaporize simultaneously with her Pyronado. The setup is very simple, and you'll want to stay inside Bennett's circle during Cyno's field time. If you're facing light enemies, this can pose some problems, as they might get tossed away from overloads that you'll need to chase them. If your team is having energy problems, this is a case where it's a good idea to equip Fav Lance on Cyno to help the entire team's energy needs. Next, Cyno can perform as the on-field driver of a reaction soup team. This team is made up of Xingqiu, Dendro Traveler, and Thoma. Because we know Thoma applies Pyro slower, he'll have an EM build here for overloads and burgeons. Cyno can still keep his crit build, as he will be dealing lots of raw electro damage as he drives his teammates' abilities while proccing some reactions here and there. One concern of this team, however, is that it's very energy hungry as they all rely on their bursts. To play this team smoothly, I had Cyno on a Favonius Lance. Against light enemies too, they might occasionally be thrown away by Thoma proccing Overload. One last tip is to make sure DMC's burst comes in contact with Hydro first for its transfiguration. That way it won't explode prematurely if Thoma's pyrocones touch it. What about turning Cyno into a Hypercarry? This is the type of team where you're throwing all your buffs on Cyno. I tried this with Yun Jin, Dendro Traveler, and Zhongli. It's technically an Aggravate format, but Cyno is the only one dishing out damage. I prefer Zhongli instead of Kazuha because the defensive utility is more valuable here. The rotation required to make Kazuha swirl Electro makes his buffs expire sooner when it's Cyno's field time. Bennett would have a similar problem in that regard, and placing his burst between DMC's and Cyno's could accidentally explode DMC's burst. And having another Electro unit to aggravate instead of Yunjin will be better, but this is one way to really make him the star in your team. There are some teams that I tried but ended up not liking as much. This doesn't mean you can't use and experiment with them, but I'll just mention my thoughts about them. I tried a non-aggravate mono Electro team with Cyno. Long story short, an aggravate team will do better. This underutilizes Cyno's kit as he does not trigger any reactions in it. He can drive teammates like Beidou or Fischl, but you'd also need someone like Kazuha or Zhongli to make this team feel decent. I'd personally suggest switching it to an aggravate team instead, but if you really want to see only raw Electro damage, then it can work. Another niche use would be an Overload team. It's also not as optimal as his standard DPS teams, and it's not recommended against enemies that get thrown away since you're doing consecutive overloads. Cyno's pyro teammates here can simply be the classic Xiangling Bennett duo. Now, there are some characters that you might be wondering about that seem like they would synergize with Cyno, so I'll briefly discuss their pros and cons here. Albedo has the benefit of not being too intrusive on Cyno's reactions and bringing an EM buff with his burst. You can proc crystallize reactions for some protection. In general, he functions fine as a flex slot off-field DPS in Cyno's teams. Next, some may wonder if Candace and Cyno work together in a Hyperbloom team. Due to how Candace's kit works, which does Hydro Infusion and Hydro Application by swapping characters, it's not suited to Cyno's role. However, there is this property of Candace's C6, where she can apply Hydro every 2.3 seconds when the active character does a normal attack. The question I have to answer is the ICD of this mechanic, and maybe that might hint if Candace can be passable or very unusable with Cyno. Although Sara specializes in buffing her Electro teammates, her buff unfortunately is just too short for Cyno's long field time, and considering that players may find her clunky pre-C2, comping her for Cyno is hard to recommend and will even be a damage loss compared to just placing another Electro DPS. Finally, a quick note about including a Cryo unit for a freeze Hyperbloom team. Freezing enemies won't disrupt the Dendro reactions and can be beneficial by keeping them in place. It's workable, but Cyno's skill during his burst form breaks the frozen state. Budget Cryo units for this role would be Rosaria, Kaeya, and Diona. Rosaria and Kaeya will mostly deliver DPS, though their bursts don't last that long without their second constellations. Diona would be a better option for survivability, but won't have much damage to contribute. At least at C6 she has an EM buff. Overall, Cryo units are more of flex or want not need teammates. And that's it for this video. These are teams that I've personally tested and can recommend. There will be some off-meta or niche teams out there that players can discover and experiment more with. If it works for you, then it works. I look forward to seeing more teams develop over time with Cyno, especially when more characters drop that can synergize with him. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!